Now, in terms of dealing with hangover, when the alcohol has been largely cleared from your system, well, that's where some of this kind of old lore combines with some of the modern science and says, well, if you can spike adrenaline, and certainly getting into an ice bath or getting into a cold shower or any kind of cold body of water, provided you can do that safely, that will sharply increase your adrenaline and, I should say, your dopamine. That's been shown, and we've talked about this on the podcast before. You get these long, extended increases, several hours of increases in dopamine from deliberate cold exposure. It's well documented in humans, by the way. So one could imagine using deliberate cold exposure as a way to accelerate the recovery from hangover. Provided that's done safely, I think there's no reason to not explore that. And if you wonder what safely is and what temperatures to use, please check out the episode on deliberate cold exposure. Cold showers, therefore, might actually be one way to at least partially relieve hangover. Certainly the science from various places in the literature converge to say that. But again, be careful, please be careful not to get into cold water when you are inebriated. It's absolutely dangerous for all the obvious reasons, and it's dangerous also for the non-obvious reasons, not the least of which is the dramatic decreases in core body temperature that can make you dangerously hypothermic. Now, how would you go about using deliberate cold exposure to accelerate recovery from hangover? Well, there I would look to the kind of standard protocols of, 1 to 3 minutes or maybe even 6 minutes if you can tolerate it. If you're really cold adapted, maybe you do 7 or 10 minutes in a cold shower, although that could be a lot. Most people are going to experience a sharp increase in epinephrine and adrenaline and a long-lasting increase in dopamine from 1 to 3 minutes of deliberate cold exposure, ideally done immersion up to the neck. Again, do this safely, please. Or a cold shower where you're getting under the shower as much as possible. How cold? Well, that's going to vary person to person. I suggest making it as cold as is uncomfortable such that you really want to get out, but then you can stay in safely without, for instance, giving yourself a heart attack. Because if the water is really, really cold, of course, you could give yourself a heart attack. Most showers won't go that cold, although probably some will. Again, please use caution. Spike your adrenaline, spike your dopamine with deliberate cold exposure safely. Other components of hangover that could be good targets for trying to alleviate hangover. And here I hope you are getting the picture because it is accurate to say that hangover is a multifaceted phenomenon. It's not like one molecule and one receptor. It's a bunch of things happening in the brain and body. But is the dehydration associated with alcohol? Alcohol is a diuretic for multiple reasons. It causes people to excrete not only water, but also sodium. Sodium is an electrolyte critical for the function of neurons. So making sure that you have enough sodium, potassium, and magnesium, so-called electrolytes, is going to be important for proper brain function, bodily organ function. Even for people that have just had 1 or 2 drinks the night before, it's likely that your electrolyte balance and your fluid balance is going to be disrupted. And that's because alcohol also disrupts the so-called vasopressin pathway. I talked a lot about vasopressin and the way that it interacts with and controls different aspects of water retention and water release from the body in the form of urine in the episode on salt. So I'm referring to hubermanlab.com as the site where you can find that episode on salt balance and ways to restore electrolyte balance. Having your electrolytes at the proper levels before you drink is ideal. Some people will say for every glass of alcohol that you drink, you should drink 1 glass of water. I would say better would be 2 glasses of water, given the dehydrating effects of alcohol, and even better would be water with electrolytes. That certainly would set you up for a better day the next day. And if you don't manage to do that, because I suppose it's kind of geeky walking around with electrolyte packets out at the bar or whatnot, although, geeky in my book is a good thing. The next day, you could take some electrolytes upon waking, maybe even some before you go to sleep at the night of drinking. So hangovers made worse by disturbed sleep, made worse by disrupted gut microbiome, made worse by disrupted electrolytes, made worse by the depletion of epinephrine and dopamine. That's why replenishing the microbiome with fermented foods, low sugar fermented foods, that is. That's why using safe, deliberate cold exposure for spiking adrenaline and for increasing dopamine. And that's why consuming electrolytes are all going to be beneficial. The folks over at examine.com, a website that I really like because it just has so much useful information, have assembled a list of things that have been purported to improve, or I should say to remove the effects of hangover. And as they point out, and I would like to point out over there isn't a lot of quality science to support the idea that any one compound can eliminate hangover. And that's probably because hangover, again, arises from multiple organs and tissues and systems in both the brain and body. Nonetheless, they have a terrific list over there of things, everything from Japanese pear fruit juice has been proposed to do this, to some other really esoteric things, even things like yohimbine. Frankly, when I look at the literature there and elsewhere, one simply cannot find the magic substance, the one herb, the one potion that can wipe away hangover. Getting rid of hangover is going to be best solved by doing a collection of a small number of very powerful things, of which I've already listed off a few. However, there are some additional things that one can do for relieving hangover. And one of them is to be very thoughtful about what sorts of alcohol one consumes. So I find this interesting. There have actually been studies of which types of alcohol lead to the greatest hangovers. There's actually a lot of legend and lore about this as well. Some people have said, for instance, that drinks that have a high sugar content lead to greater hangovers. Turns out that's not the case, or at least that's not what the science points to. If you look at the expected hangover severity, what you find is that at the bottom end of the scale, there's a drink that I'm not going to tell you for the moment. But what you find is that near it is, for instance, beer. The consumption of beer, provided it is not overconsumption, right? It's not far beyond the tolerance of the individual. So there's 1 or 2 beers, is less likely to cause a hangover than, say, whiskey. And a glass of whiskey, or I should, not as much whiskey as beer, of course, but a glass of whiskey, for instance, is more likely to cause hangover than gin is, it turns out. Again, this is what's fallen out of the data. And yet a glass of rum or red wine is more likely to cause a hangover than any of the other things I've mentioned so far. At the top of the list of drinks that induce hangover is brandy. And one could then say, well, doesn't brandy have a lot of sugar? Maybe it's the sugar that's causing hangovers. And this is something that's been, again, discussed over and over, that people say, oh, it's the high sugar drinks that cause hangover. It turns out, however, that when one looks at drinks, alcoholic drinks and sugar content and hangover, at the very bottom of the list is, and gosh, this makes me cringe just to think about, is ethanol diluted in orange juice. Ugh. I can't believe people actually drink this, but ethanol diluted in orange juice. So this is not vodka and orange juice, okay? Vodka was third on the list from the bottom of drinks that induce hangover. Again, this is within amounts that are comfortable for the person to drink, that they have enough experience with, or that they have the body weight to tolerate without getting very, very drunk. So the point is that if it were sugar that's causing hangover, well, then the ethanol diluted in orange juice would probably be at the top of the list in terms of inducing hangover, but it's not. It's at the bottom of the list. And brandy is at the top of the list. So what you find is that what scales from ethanol diluted in orange juice to beer to vodka to gin, here I'm ascending the hierarchy of things that cause hangover: gin, white wine, whiskey, rum, red wine, and then brandy at the peak. It's sort of the world heavyweight champion of hangover-inducing drinks. Well, what's increasing are congeners within those drinks. Congeners are things like nitrites and other substances that give alcohol its distinctive flavor and that also lead to some of the inebriating effects of alcohol. Now, then you ask, okay, well, what is it that these congeners are doing, and what are these nitrites doing? And guess what? While they do have effects on the brain and on other tissues, their main effects are to disrupt the gut microbiome. So what this points to, again, is that having a healthy gut microbiome and perhaps ensuring that you bolster your gut microbiome the day after drinking is going to be especially important for warding off hangover, or at least reducing the effects of hangover or the symptoms of hangover, or both. I would love to see a study on this. I could imagine designing the study myself, although this isn't really the sorts of things my laboratory does. But you can imagine some people getting probiotic and prebiotic, some regularly, some just after drinking, or low sugar fermented foods, and see what the effects are in terms of subjective effects of hangover, but also some physiological measures. I think the way to think about hangover overall is that, again, it represents a multifaceted, multi-organ, multi-tissue phenomenon. And the best way to deal with it is as a multi-cell, multi-tissue, multi-chemical phenomenon. And before I listed off some of the things that one could do in order to adjust hangover, again, the one that comes out at the top of that list, I believe, at least based on my read of the data, is to support the gut microbiome, and certainly not to ingest more alcohol. And I suppose if we were to get really honest with one another and ask what's the best way to avoid a hangover, it would be to not drink in the first place. So we've covered the major effects of alcohol that lead to this state that we call drunkenness or inebriation. Again, there's a range there. You can be tipsy, people can be blackout drunk, people can be passed out drunk. We've also talked about hangover and the fact that it's a multifaceted phenomenon, and recovery from hangover involves a multifaceted approach. Next, I want to talk about tolerance. Tolerance to alcohol is a very interesting phenomenon. It has roots mainly in the brain and in brain systems. There's not time in the world, let alone within this podcast, to get into all the aspects of tolerance. There are more than 10 different types of tolerance. There's functional tolerance, chronic tolerance, rapid tolerance. There's metabolic tolerance. There's psychological tolerance. Let's keep it simple for sake of today's discussion. And for those of you that are interested in learning about all the different types of tolerance and aspects of tolerance, there's an excellent review. We will provide a link to this. This was published in 2021, so it's pretty recent, in the journal Pharmacology, Biochemistry, and Behavior. Incidentally, or not so incidentally, that was the first journal I ever published in. So I have a particular affection for that journal. Nonetheless, it is called Tolerance to Alcohol, a Critical Yet Understudied Factor in Alcohol Addiction. And while this paper does include alcohol addiction in the title, it's not just about alcohol addiction. Here's the basic summary of what tolerance is. First of all, tolerance refers to the reduced effects of alcohol with repeated exposure. And it is caused mainly by changes in neurotransmitter systems in the brain that are the direct consequence of the toxicity of alcohol, that aldehyde molecule that we talked about before. There's an enormous number of chemicals that change with repeated exposure to acetaldehyde, everything from GABA to dopamine to serotonin, second messenger systems, adenosine, and on and on. Rather than go into each of those in detail, I just want to talk about the contour of the reinforcing and the tolerance-inducing effects of alcohol. What do I mean by that? Well, here we are back to our old friend, meaning the molecule that comes up over and over again in these podcast episodes, which is dopamine. Whether or not somebody has a predisposition to alcoholism or not, whether or not they're an experienced drinker or not, when people initially start drinking, there are increases in dopamine, or what we call dopaminergic transmission. Dopamine is involved in motivation, craving. It creates a sense of well-being. It increases energy. Again, typically only at the beginning of alcohol exposure. That occurs in most people as a sharp spike, as an increase.